Consumer First Alerts hit the road this week. Our Tammy Elliott was invited to speak at a seminar in Shawano yesterday. The title, Don't Get Scammed, Staying Safe in the Cyber World. Tammy and others sharing with attendees many of the lessons and warnings that she brings us weekly, of course, in her Consumer First Alerts. And we're joined by Tammy Elliott, as we always are on Fridays, to talk about Consumer First Alerts, but we're going to talk about all the consumers that you were alerting yesterday in this speech. I'm curious how receptive this audience was, and the things that you talked about that we talk about every week. Was any of that new to them?
I think they were very attentive and aware, and knowing that we're all getting the phone calls and the text message scams that are really blowing up, talking a lot about that. You know, they were such a good, attentive audience, and then they followed up with questions as well. And I think some of the surprising things to them were how involved some of the scams were and how devastating they can be, not just financially, but also emotionally. I shared some examples of recent stories that we've talked about here. An extremely elaborate Medicare scam, if you'll recall, in the last month. A woman who shared her story with us because she wanted to alert others. I mean, there were calls impersonating her pharmacy, Medicare, even her doctor's office, so much so that she was willing, and she said, I knew I shouldn't be giving up my Medicare number, but it was so convincing that she did. And so I think how elaborate and how much these scams have evolved, that creating this problem, and then the scammer will step in and say, I'm going to help you. You know, either I'm an investigator or, you know, I'm with the FBI. I mean, they just use such an elaborate story to try and convince people, and it works sometimes, sadly.
Speaking of convincing people, sometimes it's hard for you to convince someone to come talk to you about it because, again, that stigma of being embarrassed and et cetera. I'm curious if maybe this forum yesterday may help in that regard. Was there talk of that? Like, it's okay to speak out? Yeah,
I definitely talked about that. And I think that's one of the things that I highlighted. It's showing the people who I've interviewed and their willingness to come forward.
So much more effective too, right?
Right, absolutely. And in fact, one of the stories that I did, I talked with a fraud investigator at a local bank, and that fraud investigator happened to be in the audience, to my surprise, yesterday, which was great. And she was shaking her head and also talking about education, right? Awareness, so important. And also employees at banks, at stores, at drugstores, and different areas of all being aware of scams and the attempts and how they work. That just can help us all be educated.
Right, and be aware of things that are happening in present time. Obviously with the Cellcom situation, there have been attempts for folks to take advantage of that and making people then victims. And that's something you've talked about a lot with us, this shift in identifying those who have been taken advantage of as victims. How important was that in the narrative yesterday?
Absolutely. I talked about that these are crimes. And I talked about that with you, Chris, and really a shift. And I talked with the fraud investigator for AARP, and they really have focused on that in the last year or so, about the stigma, removing that, the embarrassment. I mean, these are crimes. And these are criminals, and the scams that are happening, you know, you are a victim of a crime and you should report this. And we have to start talking about it. And the more that people talk about it, the more that people report it, they can follow these patterns and get to those criminals and hold them accountable.
All right, Tammy, thanks so much for doing this. Appreciate it.